Good day. I'm going to begin this program. I'm going to discuss in the first part of this program the situation in Ukraine, but there are at least two events now taking shape which, in my opinion, overshadow them in importance. The first is the visit of Xi Jinping to Moscow, and as I'm making this program, there's now confirmation that Xi Jinping has indeed arrived in Moscow. He is physically present. He's going to be meeting Putin very soon. Putin has already written a long article for the People's Daily talking about Russian-Chinese relations in extremely laudatory terms. And in my opinion, this meeting between the President of China, the President of Russia, and the fact that it is taking place in Moscow, all of them essentially seal the important relationship that China and Russia have established with each other. I'm going to discuss this further later in this program, though I would say that as of this time, we don't yet have much information about this visit, and I anticipate that my comments about this visit of Xi Jinping to Moscow will be relatively short, at least in this program. The other event, which is, I suspect, going to overshadow events in Ukraine over the next few days and weeks, is the financial crisis. And I think it's now becoming increasingly clear that this is a crisis that affects more than a few relatively small banks in the United States. There are now growing signs that it is metastasizing and might soon become systemic. I'm going to discuss this also later in this program, though it should be said we are in a complex situation and there's a lot going on there. And I don't pretend to know the whole story, though I would reiterate again what I've said in previous programs about the financial crisis, about any financial crisis. I doubt that there is any single individual who does know the whole story or has any real idea of what's going to happen next. Anyway, with that, I'm going to return first to the topic, the main topic of this channel over this last year, which is the situation in Ukraine, which, to be very clear, is directly connected in all kinds of ways with all the other issues. If there is particular interest in Xi Jinping's visit to Moscow, and if there is a crisis in the global financial system, be under no doubt that those two events, even though they may overshadow the Ukraine war, they are intimately connected with it. So what is actually happening in the battlefields in Ukraine? Well, the short answer is that there has been an extraordinary cascade of news from the battlefronts over the last 24 hours. In fact, there's been so much that I'm not going to deny that I'm having trouble keeping track of all that's going on. It's taking place in multiple different places, and in the two crucial battlefronts at the moment, Bakhmut and Avdeevka. As I said, there's a lot of fog of war, but it's reasonably clear what is going on. Let's turn firstly to Bakhmut. There's more reports of more fighting within the town itself. I said yesterday in my program that the Russians seem to be close to clearing the Azov factory, and they'd apparently reached the stadium. Apparently there's intense fighting going on close to the stadium, and eventually, presumably, the Russians intend to storm the stadium as well. There's also lots of information about further Russian advances in the areas around Bakhmut. And here I have to say straightforwardly that I'm having increasing problems understanding exactly where some of these advances are taking place. But to the best of my knowledge, another village close to what is said to be this key village of Orekhovo-Ivanovka has now been captured. That increases the effective encirclement of Orekhovo-Ivanovka. So it does seem as if the Russians are continuing to make continuous progress there. And it looks like they're also making progress near Bogdanovka, which is another village further south. I'm going to say, again, this is on my own understanding of the battle. I may be quite wrong, but I suspect that if the Russians capture Bogdanovka, then the occupation of Khromovo, the village on the road between Chasov Yar and Bakhmut, the northern spur of the road, the occupation of Khromovo becomes inevitable, severing what has been at various times the single most important supply route or remaining supply route for Ukraine in trying to keep its troops in Bakhmut itself supplied with food, ammunition, and reinforcements. So a complex situation unveiling in Bakhmut. I'm not going to pretend that I understand every aspect of this battlefront, and I now want to turn to the content of a private email which I received yesterday. Now, I should say that the person who sent me this email is somebody who I have been familiar with, who writes on open sources. I'm hoping that you won't mind later if I disclose where this information has come from, but at the moment it is a private email. I don't have that permission, so I'm not going to identify the source. In this case, I would like to do so. Anyway, this person has written an extremely helpful email, and this person, as I said, is a very authoritative source, and this person, unlike me, has the ability to read maps and to actually see the contour positions, to get a very accurate sense of the topography around Bakhmut. And the key takeaway from this email is that the idea of Bakhmut being surrounded by high ground is essentially a myth. Yes, there is sort of undulations in the landscape, but in no sense are we talking about a town in some sort of valley surrounded by peaks. I never thought it was quite like that. We're talking about low-lying hills, undulations in the landscape. There are no doubt some woods in these places and things of that kind. But this is not a place where we're talking about, very high ground dominating the landscape in the way that some people have been claiming. And I'm going to suggest that this story about the high ground around Bakhmut, these sort of peaks that overlook both Bakhmut itself and other places further west like Kramatorsk, that it actually originated in Ukrainian sources. They have been reassuring Western journalists that in the event that Bakhmut falls, well, it'll be no big deal because there are all these strong locations, positions further west, these sort of hill crests that can be used as positions to hold back the Russian advance, but that, of course, it's important to retain control of these positions, because unless these positions are indeed controlled in that kind of way, well, the Russians will gain control of these positions and will be able to launch artillery strikes from high ground onto Kramatorsk and Slavyansk. Apparently, this is not, strictly speaking, the case, or at least it's likely that the Russians would be able to start shelling Kramatorsk, certainly, perhaps Slavyansk as well, once Bakhmut falls. But this idea of some kind of mini Alp that, the Russians can look down upon and can fire artillery on Kramatorsk, it's an exaggeration. Anyway, that is this information, and I would like, first of all, to acknowledge my debt to this person for correcting this. As I said, I've been going along with this story of the high ground because, well, as I said, I can't read maps very well. My eyesight, my vision issues make that impossible, and I don't really understand maps anyway. And I'd like to acknowledge both my debt to this person and extend my thanks and say that I'm very grateful for this correction, and I hope that, as I said, this person going forward will not mind if I attribute this correction to this person and identify this person by name, or at least by reference to the place where he writes. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about Bakhmut. As I said, we have a dynamic situation. At least what I'm going to say about the fighting in Bakhmut, a dynamic situation. We are seeing Russian advances. As I said, I'm not entirely clear about every single move and tactical maneuver that is taking place, but the direction of travel is clear. The Russians are steadily, methodically taking more and more of Bakhmut itself under control, and they're enlarging the territory outside Bakhmut that they're also taking under their control. Now, there continue to be these rumors of a Ukrainian counterattack, and I'm going to say straight away that, in my opinion, the time window for this Ukrainian counterattack is now closing. Now, the military summary channel says that it will probably start on Thursday. There have been some attempts by Ukraine to launch local counterattacks over the last couple of days. Apparently, all of them have failed. But perhaps on Thursday we will see something bigger. I'm going to say this: unless this counterattack starts soon, then I think the Ukraine's chances of reversing or stabilizing the situation around Bakhmut is going to dwindle to the point of disappearance. Whether it is wise of Ukraine to launch a counterattack in and around Bakhmut, to expend more men and material trying to, regain control of lost positions in Bakhmut, perhaps break the siege entirely, perhaps do other things, that is another question. But as I said, if that is indeed Ukraine's intention, then as I said, it seems to me that the time window to do it is closing fast. And I'm going to make a further prediction: unless it's done at some point this week, then I am going to guess that leaving it beyond that is going to be too late. I want to stress again, that's a guess. I may be wrong, but I would have thought that time is now ticking away. By the start of next week, it's quite possible that the situation in and around Bakhmut, from Ukraine's point of view, will have been rendered irretrievable. So we will see what Ukraine does. We will see how many forces Ukraine has indeed assembled in and around Bakhmut, specifically at Casualties, what Ukraine actually intends to do these forces, and of course, if there is a counterattack, how successful it will be. So this question of what goes on in Bakhmut, it's not ended by any means. We'll have to wait and see what is going on there. Now, even as the situation in Bakhmut is deteriorating, we are now getting more and more reports that Ukraine is facing a crisis in Avdeevka. And again, it's not easy to get a precise picture of what is going on in Avdiivka, but shortly after confirmation of the fall of Krasnogorovka, we've now received reports, and these are purely reports from Russian sources, but I have no reason to doubt that they are true, that another village to the north of Avdeevka, Kamenka, has now also been captured by the Russians, and that they're now closing their pincers around Bakhmut. And again, interestingly enough, the major advance, the stronger of the two pincer movements, appears to be pushing towards the western areas of Avdeevka from the north. Apparently there was an attempted Ukrainian counterattack against the southern pincer towards two villages, Voidova and Opitnoye. By the way, there's a place, very confusingly, called Opitnoye near Bakhmut. This is Opitnoye near Avdeevka. They're completely different places. There's many places in this part of the world that seem to have the same names, and that can be very confusing. But anyway, there was apparently an attempted Ukrainian counterattack along the southern pincer that the Russians have been pushing to try to sort of close the ring around Avdeevka. The Russians claim that this particular counterattack failed, and as I said, fighting is becoming more intense. And I saw a report this morning that the Russians have now actually broken into Avdeevka itself from the south, and that there is now fighting going on within the town of Avdeevka itself. I am also reading reports that the Russians are pushing hard towards the major road that the Ukrainians have been using to keep Avdeevka supplied, and it is a road that comes to Avdeevka from the northwest, and of course that perhaps explains why the northern pincer of the Russian forces is apparently stronger than the southern pincer. Now, there's much less reporting about the fighting in Avdeevka than there is about the fighting in Bakhmut. One of the reasons, as I've discussed many times, is that there isn't a colourful personality like Yevgeny Prigozhin who gives us a non-stop commentary about what is going on in and around Avdeevka. But anyway, again, though there may be uncertainties about some of the details, the direction of travel is clear. Ukraine is facing an operational crisis in Avdeevka. And over the last couple of hours, there's been a cascade of increasingly anxious reports on Ukrainian Telegram channels. And by the way, Ukrainian Telegram channels, though I've tended to find that they're less informative than Russian ones, and dare I say it, rather more, shall we say, well, I'm going to say propagandistic than Russian ones. Nonetheless, I think that the quality of war reporting on both sides has been high, and this extends to the Ukrainian channels also. Anyway, they're becoming more and more concerned about the situation in Avdeevka, and the Russians, of course, are becoming more and more confident. And whilst I'm on this topic, there's been, for the first time, to my knowledge, alarm bells being sounded about the situation in Avdeevka in the latest intelligence update from the British Ministry of Defence. And, it again talks about slow, creeping, incremental Russian advances around Avdeevka. But the very fact that the entire update from the British Ministry of Defence is in fact devoted to the fighting in and around Avdeevka perhaps is a better sign of how critical the situation is becoming. And one thing that the British Ministry of Defence did do, again, which was helpful, is that they identified the Russian forces involved in this battle. Now, as we know, the spearhead, at least, of the Russian attack on Bakhmut has been the Wagner organization. The spearhead of the Russian attack on Avdeevka is the first corps of the Donetsk militia. Now, this includes some extremely well-trained and powerful units. The Sparta battalion comes to mind. And so we are talking here about some very high-quality troops. But note again that this is not the regular Russian army. I'm not saying that the regular Russian military are not involved. They are obviously there. They're providing most of the artillery, I suspect. They're providing the supplies, the shelling of Avdeevka. And of course, they're bombing Avdeevka. The Russian Air Force has been operating heavily around Avdeevka over the last few weeks. And there's no doubt at all that this is one of the major reasons why the Russian advances in Avdeevka have been so fast. But note again that this is a military unit, a military force, this first corps of the Donetsk militia that has been involved in the war from the outset. In fact, you can trace back its history all the way back to the fighting in 2014. So, again, the major formations of the Russian army, the Russian military, now concentrating around Ukraine, hundreds of thousands of men that we are seeing. They've not been committed to the battle yet in big numbers. At the moment, the fighting in Avdeevka, in Bakhmut, indeed further north in Kupiansk, where it is the regular Russian military, but here in the advance on Kupiansk, which by the way is still ongoing, there's been more reports of more fortified positions around Kupiansk being captured by the Russians. Well, that advance has been carried out by a motorized rifle division of the Russian army, which, to my knowledge, has also been involved in the fighting ever since the start of the present stage of the conflict in February, March. So this is not the additional forces that the Russians have assembled and brought to the battlefields since Putin announced that additional mobilization of 300,000 reservists back in September. So it's important to say that the Russians are still holding back their punches. They're not carrying out attacks with all their forces up to this point. Now, I'm going to say one other thing about the actual conduct of the battle, the fighting in Avdeevka, Bakhmut. I've no doubt at all that as this fighting continues, it is Ukraine that is suffering the heaviest losses. Suffering the heaviest losses in Bakhmut. It's probably going to suffer the heaviest losses in Avdeevka. If Ukraine launches a counterattack in Bakhmut under the fire of the Russian guns, then it's going to suffer heavier losses still. And if the counterattack in Bakhmut either fails to take place or is repelled, is defeated, and Bakhmut is encircled, and the remaining Ukrainian troops within Bakhmut are either forced to surrender or destroyed, killed, then, of course, Ukrainian losses will be much heavier still. And if Avdeevka is taken into a cauldron, as some Russian officials are now saying, and as some Ukrainian officials and commentators are now starting to worry, then, of course, in Avdeevka, Ukraine will also be suffering very high losses. But the very significant uptick in the fighting that is taking place in Bakhmut, Avdeevka, Kupiansk, and by the way also in Vuhledar, must mean that Russian losses have been growing as well. Now, I have to say this has probably been true since the beginning of this year, when, as I said, the fighting in all of these places simultaneously intensified. It's never possible to give a complete, accurate picture of Russian losses. But again, I noticed that the BBC and Media Zone have come up with another updated figure, which is around 16,000 of Russian troops, including, by the way, Wagner forces, who can be securely identified as having been killed since the start of the military operations in February last year. And of course, that is very far from the figures that have been floating around of the Russians having suffered losses of 200,000 men dead and wounded. It doesn't come anywhere close to that number. I'm still not certain, by the way, whether this figure of 16,000 includes the Donbass militia. It undoubtedly does include the Wagner organization, losses of the Wagner organization. It includes Chechen forces as well. But it may not include Donbass militia. So it's probably, in fact, it's undoubtedly somewhat higher, probably more than 20,000. But I cannot see, and again I have to say this, I cannot see that there is any justification in multiplying this total in the way that some people want to do. I think this is a reasonably accurate total for the number of soldiers who've been actually killed in the fighting, and it is consistent with the data that the Russian Ministry of Defense from time to time provides. So, just saying this. Now, even as we're having all that fighting going on in Bakhmut, in Avdeevka, in Kupiansk, we are getting reports of preparations by Ukraine for its much talked about, much discussed offensive in the south towards presumably the Black Sea. And yesterday there were reports that a Ukrainian reconnaissance force had tried to force the Dnieper River in Kherson region, had apparently been engaged by Russian artillery. They'd been thrown back, or so I understand. Most of them had been either driven back, some of them had been killed. But anyway, there was an attempt at some kind of a reconnaissance in force across the Dnieper River. And by the way, I understand that it is in this area, along these sort of lines, that the Russians have positioned some of those T-62 tanks we've been hearing so much about. Essentially, the Russians are using them not as tanks exactly, but as a kind of artillery to knock out, to destroy any Ukrainian boats that try to cross the river. And they're relatively simple tanks to understand and to use, and they have a very powerful smooth-bore gun, which when it was introduced in the 1960s was far ahead of its time. Western tanks did not start to appear with similar smooth-bore guns until late in the 1970s and early 80s, and so it was a sort of revolutionary gun in its day, and it is still one of the most powerful tank guns in operation. And of course, the Russians are able to use it, and that's really why apparently they've brought some of these T-62s out of retirement. And apparently there's a factory in Chita, in the Far East, which is modernizing them. I have to say I was skeptical about the T-62 story, but this is apparently where they're actually being used. They're not going to be operated in tank-to-tank combat or in in offensive operations. And the tanks further north, where the Russian and Ukrainian forces are facing off against each other, and where tank battles might happen. The tanks that the Russians are going to use there are the much more advanced T-90Ms and the modernized T-80s and modernized T-72s. Now, I'm not an expert in tanks, but again, I'd like to acknowledge my debt to Jim Kinnair. He has written, in my opinion, by far the most informative books about these tanks and war machines. You can find his books on the T-62, on more modern Russian armored vehicles. You can find them on the internet, on Amazon in some cases. The very latest books, I'm afraid, you have to contact the Swedish publisher to get hold of copies. Anyway, I just mentioned this, hunted around. These seem to me to be the best and most informative books on the subject. Anyway, so there was an attempted Ukrainian crossing of the Dnieper by some kind of a sabotage group yesterday. Apparently it failed. And there's been a whole series of Ukrainian attacks on Russian positions in Zaporizhzhia region, some of them clear to the town of Orechov, which the Russians approached over the course of the Russian northward push in Zaporizhzhia in January. I've come increasingly to think that this is somehow connected to the fighting in Vuhledar. I'm not going to discuss it further in this program. The Russians say that all of these attacks have been repelled and that the Ukrainians have suffered significant losses, but the Russians are making it increasingly clear that they believe that these attacks are basically probing attacks, attacks to probe their defenses before the big Ukrainian spring offensive in this part of the battlefronts is launched. And we have had quite a lot of information now about what's going on here from our old friend Vladimir Rogov, chairman of the We Are Together with Russia movement, who is one of the officials of the Russian-appointed Zaporizhzhia regional government. And he's provided this report, and I'm taking this from the TASS news agency. And he says that the Ukrainian armed forces, this is the TASS report, have become active in the Zaporizhzhia direction, attempting at least 7 times over the week to conduct reconnaissance in force in different directions of the line of contact, Vladimir Rogov told TASS on Monday. Over the last week, there were 2 major incidents and 5 or 6 smaller ones. The Ukrainian armed forces stepped up a week and a half ago. They're conducting reconnaissance not just with the help of agents on the ground, who continue to live under the guise of civilians, NATO satellites and drones. They are ready to sacrifice dozens of fighters and equipment, understanding that thanks to this, they will have a clear picture of our defense capabilities and timing of reaction to this or that action, Rogov said. And then TASS goes on to say that according to Rogov, Ukrainian forces use the same algorithm, an airstrike, a reactive multiple rocket launch, and then the advance of equipment with infantry. The Ukrainian armed forces are willing to sacrifice their fighters in order to understand the architecture of our security, the defense build-up, what forces are where, how quickly the interaction between different groups of troops takes place. Thus, having noticed their advance, our artillery, aviation, and motorized infantry go into position. All this is done for a reason. We should not become complacent after each repulsed attack. It is not an attack, but a reconnaissance in force. And TASS then goes on to say, according to Rogov's assessment, the activity of the Ukrainian military is connected with the preparation of an offensive in the Zaporizhzhia region. There is no doubt that the attempts of the Ukrainian armed forces to conduct reconnaissance in force will intensify, that the offensive attempt will be exactly in the Zaporizhzhia direction. And he then goes on to say that the Ukrainian military has practically stopped using precision munitions and kamikaze drones in the Zaporizhzhia area that can evidence its attempt to mass armaments ahead of a potential offensive in the region. The adversary is actually using no precision weapons now. The deliveries are underway and increasing, but they do not expend them, which testifies to force amassment. Their attacks, their full-scale offensive, will be accompanied by strikes from HIMARS and M777 guns using guided munitions and shells and the mass employment of kamikaze drones. We know that the adversary side has a great amount of them, but they are being employed on a limited scale now. The amassment of precision munitions and drones by the Ukrainian side and the Kiev regime's attempts to conduct reconnaissance by fire in the Zaporizhzhia area are related to the preparations for the offensive. To my mind, they're amassing armaments to start active operations and deliver a guaranteed strike on our reconnoitred positions, strikes on command posts to deprive us of coordination, depots and military hardware sites. I believe that this will be a simultaneous strike, following which their armour and infantry will push forward. So there we are, a big offensive being prepared by Ukraine in Zaporizhzhia region. That's what the Russians think. We see the first probing attempts by Ukraine preparing for this offensive. And we'll see when and if that offensive happens. And I'm sure that it will happen. Far too much now rides on it. And we'll see how prepared for it the Russians are. Now I'm going to make a number of quick further observations. The Ukrainian Air Force and Air Defense Commander has now grumbled that he's only getting old Warsaw Pact era MiG-29 fighter jets from the West. He says what he really needs are F-16s, and the West doesn't seem to be willing to supply them. We hear that the total number of MiG-29s that Ukraine is going to get is around 33, which is a substantial number, or so it seems to me. These are indeed old fighter jets. They have been to some extent modernized. through their long service with the Polish and Slovak air forces, but they still apparently rely heavily on Soviet-era avionics. The radars, major electronic device carried by these aircraft, still appear to be the original Soviet-era radars of the 1980s, late 1970s and early 1980s. And I have to say straight away that I think it is most unlikely that these fighter jets are going to be effective, going to have much chance against the kind of air defense system that the Russians now operate in Ukraine, and of course the much more advanced fighter jets that the Russians now operate in Ukraine also. But presumably these 33 fighter jets are going to be provided to provide some kind of air cover for this offensive. We see that the Ukrainians are very dissatisfied. And I'm going to make a suggestion that the real reason that they're unhappy is that MiG-29s apparently were designed by the MiG Bureau back in the 1970s as pure air superiority fighters. They weren't really designed for airstrikes. They can, up to a certain point, obviously carry bombs. They can, to some extent, be adapted to launch these glide bombs that the United States is trying to integrate with these fighter jets. But they're not really the best aircraft to support ground troops. And I suspect that the reason the Ukrainians are unhappy is because they feel that the F-16s would have been better for that role. At least that's my guess. Anyway, MiG-29s is all they're going to get. I haven't heard any reports that the tanks, the Leopard 2 tanks and the Challenger 2 tanks are yet in service. Presumably they will be at some point, maybe in late March. I don't know about the infantry fighting vehicles and all of those things. And of course we know about the heavy ammunition shortages that we've been hearing so much about. But anyway, whatever, Ukraine is going to have to carry out this offensive with whatever it has, because the political pressure from the Western powers on Ukraine to launch this offensive is now becoming overwhelming. And General Piotr Pavel, the new Czech president, basically set it out. He said, unless Ukraine launches such an offensive this year, this summer, essentially the spring and summer, and unless this offensive achieves success, he is very doubtful that Western support for Ukraine will continue for very much longer. Now, Brian Beletic has again discussed all of this in another fine program that he's done for the new Atlas. He's talked about how the Western powers are now stripping their remaining very depleted arsenals of shells, pretty much further still to try to equip the Ukrainians with more artillery shells. Indeed, I heard a report a couple of days ago that the European Union is now being badgered to provide Ukraine with up to 1 million shells this year. Now, bear in mind that a couple of weeks ago, Reznikov, the Ukraine's defense minister, wrote to the European Union saying that Ukraine needed 250,000 shells a month. So that's only 4 months of shells if the EU really does send 1 million shells to Ukraine. I discussed yesterday the fact that the industrial companies, the military industrial companies in the EU, have reported back to EU governments that they can only significantly increase shell production in about 3 years' time. It'll take them at least another 3 years to get to the point where they can start to increase shell production significantly from its extraordinarily low levels. And of course, if the EU really does send 1 million shells to Ukraine over the next few weeks in order perhaps to support this Ukrainian offensive, then that is going to leave the our armies of the EU states, which are of course NATO armies, essentially out of shells. They've also been stripped of many of their artillery pieces, as I believe the United States has been. So if they're going to support, they're going to throw everything they have at this offensive, then they're going to be out of shells, they might be out of artillery. Of course, that will make them incredibly vulnerable in the event that there is a war. But I suspect, I'm not a military person again, but I don't see myself how troops can train to use artillery if there aren't any shells to train with, or if there's far too few shells to train with and far too few artillery pieces. So one way or the other, if Ukraine does get its 1 million shells, it seems to me that what we're going to see is a further degradation of Western militaries, at least European militaries, probably the US military as well, from their already, in the European case, extremely low levels. I have to say that this would be so disastrous or potentially disastrous that I do really wonder whether it's going to happen and whether the militaries in Europe are going to finally push back against the politicians and are going to say enough is enough and that they're not going to provide Ukraine with these 1 million shells. Certainly, the last announcement of weapon supplies to Ukraine from Germany only included a package of 5,000 shells, 155 millimeter shells, which is a little more than what Ukraine uses on an average day. And the fact that it was so few shells suggests to me that there is now a real pushback. And I wonder whether a supply of 1 million shells is really a practical option. But if it does happen, it will tell us again how much is riding on this offensive. Of course, if the offensive fails, the war is lost, not just by the Ukraine, but by the West. And of course, it isn't just a case of the war being lost by Ukraine and by the West if the offensive fails. But I wonder what happens if the offensive is even partially successful. Would it really change anything significantly? I have to say, I have my doubts. And I noticed that the responsible statecraft, the website of the Quincy Institute is now increasingly sounding the alarm, and it mentions that there's increasing problems, that Ukraine is on the back foot in the fighting. It's losing ground in Bakhmut, losing ground in Avdeevka. It worries about Western abilities to keep Ukraine supplied with equipment. It worries also about the growing power and reach of China, about which in a moment. But it then contains this absolutely important sentence. The Biden administration has long argued that, the Biden administration has long argued that Ukraine's negotiating position will strengthen over time, that the decision to negotiate should be made in Kiev, not Washington, and that Russia will not come to the negotiating table until it loses significant amounts of territory that it currently occupies. But by summer, Ukraine might well have less bargaining leverage as its battlefield position stagnates. Note it only says stagnates, but of course it might not just stagnate, it might deteriorate. And its confidence in enduring American support erodes. Both Ukraine and Russia could, for different reasons, find China increasingly attractive as a potential mediator, even if neither is yet prepared for significant possessions. Washington, which sees no such attractiveness, could still play a spoiler to a China-sponsored peace proposal as it retains considerable leverage over Ukraine. But does Biden want to risk the potential domestic and international repercussions of appearing to oppose a settlement? And then he goes on to say, it is not too late for the Biden administration to find a way out of this potential trap by pressing the accelerator pedal on negotiations with Russia. For example, signaling discreetly to Moscow that we're prepared to discuss the thorny issue of Ukraine's membership in NATO, an issue Putin regards as central to the war, but which Biden has so far refused to discuss, might help to change these dynamics and reshape Russia's attitude to a settlement. It is not too soon to say that the window of opportunity, but it is not too soon to say that the window of opportunity for American diplomacy is in danger of narrowing. This article by George Beebe, very interesting. But again, I would suggest to Mr. Beebe that if he really wants to make his points, he should drop away all these qualifications, all these attempts to try and pretend that somehow things are less bad than they really are. I mean, he appears to suggest a closing window, US drifting into a trap. I think he should acknowledge that, in fact, it's not a situation of the war stagnating that the US risks. It's a situation of Ukraine being in a critical position by late summer, early autumn. It's a situation of the West becoming depleted of its military power, and it's a situation where the Chinese-Russian de facto alliance has intensified, consolidated even more. In which case, the urgency to seek some kind of diplomatic outcome to this crisis becomes more pressing still. As I said, hedging, qualifying, trying to appease the consensus in Washington, which is still pro-war, by talking only about stagnating, about the window of opportunity being only in danger of narrowing. Pulling verbal punches in this way ultimately isn't very helpful. But anyway, it gives us a sense of the growing alarm bells. And for me, the most interesting thing so far in this conflict is how the alarm bells about Xi Jinping's visit to Moscow are now ringing all across the West. We're now starting to see article after article, commentary after commentary about the Chinese-Russian alliance, the danger to the world system, the fact that these two great powers are coming together, the fact that this poses a huge challenge to the West. This is actually, it must be said, a huge reversal. I wrote an article for the Duran. That was while we were still exclusively a website, way back, I think it was in May 2016, in which I said that the relationship between China and Russia had already, by that point, become de facto an alliance. That was very much an outlier article at that time. I remember that The Economist, for example, in Britain, was still pretending otherwise. I remember that there was one issue of The Economist which had on its cover piece a title about, picture of Putin and Xi and China and Russia, and said China and Russia best of frenemies. They weren't really friends, they were really enemies, they were only pretending to be friends. And in fact, beneath it all, there was this deep antagonism and suspicion that supposedly, allegedly existed between the two. And this was widely, as I said, this was the consensus, as I remember, for many years after I wrote that article back in 2016. And suddenly, over the last few months, it's suddenly become understood that, in fact, China and Russia are indeed every bit as close as I was saying in 2016. Except, of course, that they're getting much closer. And this has been one of the great paradoxes about the Ukraine war, because when the Ukraine war began, there were all kinds of predictions. It was predicted that the Chinese would be hugely embarrassed by what the Russians had done, that it would feed doubts in Beijing about the Russians, that the Chinese and the Russians, there would be a distancing between them. There were even attempts, as I remember, in the early months of the conflict, indeed for much of the first 6 months of the conflict, to try to get the Chinese to put pressure on the Russians. I always thought those were far-fetched, to say the least. And now all that has gone. And I can also remember how before the war there was an article in the National Interest by, I think, a gentleman called Wes Marshall, former US Assistant Secretary of State. I may have got his name wrong. You can still find that article, though I think it has been edited. It is not quite the same as I remember it when I first read it. At least that was what I thought when I reread it again a few weeks ago. Anyway, at that time, this article, written in August 2021, was actually saying that it was very important for the United States to prevent China and Russia forming an alliance with each other. That would be a disaster for the United States. And the way to do that was to somehow break Russia, to engineer, well, I think the original article said a defeat for Russia in Ukraine. Doesn't say that anymore. But anyway, cause Russia a major loss. The current version of the article talks about Ukraine being the pivot. But as I said, my original recollection is that it spoke about a defeat for Russia in Ukraine. That was in August 2021, before the current fighting began. And that this would then force Russia to reorient its foreign policy and to align with the United States against China. And I've always felt that this was the original objective, that this was the plan, if you like, to sort of prepare Russia into some sort of, to break Russia away from China and to reposition it as an ally of the United States against China. And of course, the opposite has happened. China and Russia have come closer together. Russia has shrugged off the sanctions. Putin is now saying that economic growth in Russia is accelerating. I'm going to come and discuss the Russian economy again because there's been more things to say about that. But anyway, that has failed. It's also the case that it's far from clear that Russia has been weakened militarily by this war. We see that Russian military production is increasing, rising fast. We don't have all the figures, but that's certainly the impression. There's a Russian military build-up going on, and in the meantime, it's Western arsenals that are depleting. So any attempt to weaken Russia, it looks like it's going in the other direction. And absent a catastrophic defeat for Russia as a result of this Ukrainian spring counteroffensive, which I don't expect, it's now looking increasingly likely, in fact I personally have never had any doubts about it, that Russia is going to win the war in Ukraine with all the major repercussions that will follow in its wake. So this strategy of breaking up the Russian-Chinese alliance, weakening the Russian part of that alliance, it's failed. And it's not only failed in its own terms, it's having a trigger effect in terms of the Western economies. Because, well, already going into the war, the United States and the West were facing very severe rising inflation as a result of the reckless monetary expansion that has been taking place for many years and was cranked up multiples during the pandemic crisis, and then even further by the Biden administration after the pandemic crisis had ended and the lockdowns had basically ceased in its first year, when it sought to expand the US economy and achieve a growth rate faster than China's by giving the economy, the US economy, a massive monetary and fiscal stimulus. I said at the time, we on the Duran said at the time that that would lead to higher inflation, and of course it duly did. Anyway, on top of that inflation, we then had further inflation as a result of the sanctions war that the Western powers waged against Russia, which caused huge disruptions in supply chains, complications in the energy system, complications in the food supply system, which, by the way, continue. There's the grain deal between Turkey, the UN, Russia and Ukraine. It's only being extended for 60 days. The Russians are very unhappy by the way it's worked out. It could very well fail. We might start to see food prices start to rise again. Anyway, we've seen major problems, an additional surge of inflation because of the economic war. And all of this has compelled Western central banks to try to get on top of that inflation by raising interest rates. And interest rates have indeed been increased, but it must be said by not that much. interest rates are still around 4%, which by historic terms is not very high. Russia's interest rates, by the way, are 7.5%, and this against a current underlying inflation rate of around 4%. So Russian interest rates at the moment are 3.5% roughly above the actual growth of prices. If you keep your rubles in a Russian bank account, interest-bearing bank account, the value of those rubles will increase relative to the prices around you. In the West, it is still the other way around. If you keep your dollars or euros or pounds sterling in a bank account, an interest-bearing bank account, they will decrease in value because inflation is still higher than the interest rate you're likely to receive. I'm going to discuss the question of interest rates in Russia and the value of the ruble in a future program. But anyway, those interest rates, which the Western central banks have imposed, not, as I said, particularly high by historic levels, they've still proved too high because all of those years, decades of excess liquidity, of debt creation, have created major structural weaknesses in the West's financial system. I discussed this in a program I did a few weeks ago, about a week ago, 10 days ago, when the problems at SVB Bank started. And we've now seen how the increases in interest rates, low though they are now starting to create problems, not just for one or two banks, but for more banks. And we've now had the failure of one of the key banks, one of the 30 systemically important banks, Credit Suisse. It's had to be taken over by UBS, a much better run bank, it must be said. Credit Suisse was not a particularly well run bank for a long time. But anyway, it's still something of a shock to the system. And as I am making this program, there's apparently still more problems. Depositors are still pulling back money out of banks, and we're still seeing all sorts of problems with shares of banks, and there's talk about HSBC being in trouble, and apparently other banks are in trouble as well. And there's now rumours, of course I can't confirm this, that we're going to see a reversal, that interest rates are going to be cut, and that money creation, quantitative easing in some form is going to resume before very long. Well, I'm not predicting that that is the case. As I've said already, nobody can say at any particular time that there's going to be a financial crisis, a global financial crisis, until we're actually in one. Nobody, well, very few people predicted the global financial crisis of 2008, even though more and more people, as I said, were sounding the alarm bells that things were going wrong. But nobody, I think, quite understood the severity of those problems. And I suspect it's going to be the same this time. I know some people will come back and say that, well, few people did. It's true. You always find some people who always predict there's going to be an economic crash. And, every so often they turn out to be right in a particular instance. There are lots of people I know who have been saying for a long time that the financial system isn't working well. Of that, there's no doubt. We've been predicting a particular crash, that there would be a crash over due course. No doubt about that as well. But no one, it seems to me, is ever able to say that this crash is going to come on any particular day. And I'm still not predicting it. But I will say this, if things do continue to deteriorate over the course of this week, and I'm not saying they are, then I would not personally be surprised if next week we start to see emergency cuts in interest rates and a return to QE. I'm not saying it's going to happen. All I am saying is, if there's a deterioration this week, I can very well believe that it will. So, a geopolitical conflict over Ukraine, launched, in my opinion, by the Western powers. They didn't think it through. They made assumptions about the Russian economy and its resistance to sanctions, which have proved catastrophically wrong. They were, I think, expecting a rapid collapse, which didn't happen. They never expected to be drawn into the kind of war of attrition in Ukraine that they're now finding themselves trapped in. They expected that this would break the Chinese-Russian alliance. It's achieving the opposite. It's made it stronger, and it's now feeding through into a crisis in the Western financial system. The last, in immediate terms, is the most important thing of all. If over the next few weeks things really start to get horrible in the financial system, the global financial system, then I can say with confidence that Ukraine will find itself, well, not so much without friends, but with such friends as it does have, no longer interested in its plight. Perhaps the Ukrainians need to think that too, and perhaps Western leaders need to think very seriously about where all this is going. Well, thank you for this program today. More from me soon. That finishes me for the day. Just to remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin and Telegram. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. And remember also to go to our shop and check out the great things that you will find there: our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, and all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you again for joining me. More from me soon, and have a very good day. Until then.